are you, folks? Dave Brown here with the New Populace. Thank you again for joining me. Last week, I did a video on an article written by Robert Kagan, who is a very prominent neoconservative in Washington, D.C. He was the founder of PNAC, a project for a new North American century, and he is the husband of the now infamous Victoria Nuland, who is the Deputy Secretary of State. And back in 2003 to 2005, she was the foreign policy advisor for Dick Cheney. So if you think that after Bush left the White House that the neoconservatives had moved on as well, I have bad news for you. They have not. They are still in our government, and they still control policy, specifically foreign policy. Now, in that video, I was reading snippets from the article where he talked about how the United States overthrows governments. And what I pointed out was that in 2023, if you are to repeat what he said in 2008, you will be called a conspiracy theorist. You would be a Putin apologist. You would be repeating Kremlin talking points. Yet 15 years ago, this very prominent neoconservative said it explicitly that that is what we do. And ironically, 6 years later in 2014, the Ukrainian government was overthrown. And who was the person from the State Department on the ground in Kiev? Who was it? Victoria Nuland. So if anybody knows about toppling governments, it certainly would be Robert Kagan, because his wife is involved in that. Now, in this video, I want to talk about the relationship between Russia, China, and the United States, because clearly right now, that is the big thing. Can these three countries, these three great powers, get along, or are we destined for some sort of catastrophic world war? Now, in this part of the article from Robert Kagan's The End of History, he really dives into how the United States treats other countries. And by the time I'm done with this, I'll make the case that the real problem is not China or Russia, but it is the United States and our policy towards other countries. Because essentially, we think, the United States, that countries that don't conform to the liberal world order are countries that we can manipulate, we can topple, we can involve ourselves in. And actually, it's even worse than that. I'll make the argument too that it's not necessarily principle that drives us. It's simply imperialism. And that is what, unfortunately, that's the conclusion that I've arrived to based on the evidence, based on what people like Robert Kagan said and wrote. So here is the next part of his article, or a few snippets from his article, The End of History, talking about the liberal world order and the behavior of the United States. In the post-Cold War era, a triumphant liberalism has sought to expand its triumph by establishing as an international principle the right of the international community to intervene against sovereign states that abuse the rights of their people. In theory, these innovations apply to everyone. In practice, they chiefly provide democratic nations the right to intervene in the affairs of non-democratic nations. Unfortunately for China, Russia, and other autocracies, this is one area where there is no great transatlantic divide. The United States, though traditionally jealous of its own sovereignty, has always been ready to interfere in the internal affairs of other nations. The nations of Europe, once the great proponents in theory of the Westphalian order of inviolable state sovereignty, have now reversed course and produced a system, as Robert Cooper has observed, of constant mutual interference in each other's domestic affairs, right down to beer and sausages. This has become one of the great schisms in the international system, dividing the democratic world and the autocracies. For 3 centuries, international law, with the strictures against interference in the internal affairs of nations, has tended to protect autocracies. Now, the democratic world is in the process of removing that protection, while the autocrats rush to defend the principles of sovereign inviolability. So, as Kagan points out here, the United States is extremely protective when it comes to our own sovereignty, when it comes to anybody coming into our sphere of influence here in North America. We have the Monroe Doctrine, which says we do not allow great powers to come into our area and mess around. We just recently had this whole hoopla over the China spy base that is potentially being built in Cuba, and the predictable people in the U.S. government, prominent senators, were losing their minds and freaking out over that. Over this one single base in Cuba, and they thought that was a violation of our sovereignty, although, despite the fact that it's in Cuba, which is a foreign country. And didn't we make the same argument that countries on Russia's borders, they have the right to do what they want because they are free countries? Well, that rule does not apply to Cuba, to countries in Central America. If you come in there and you're doing things that we don't like, you are messing with the sovereignty of the United States. Never mind the fact that we have just opened up more bases in the northern Philippines close to Taiwan, and of course the issue with Taiwan itself. We say that officially we recognize the One China policy, which says that Taiwan is part of China, yet every day we do things to inflame that situation there and basically treat Taiwan like it's not part of China, and we are ramping up tensions there. Now, when it comes to interfering in people's countries, like Kagan said, we do that constantly. But think about 2016, 2017, how the United States was basically in this fever pitch over Russian interference in our democracy in the 2016 election. Now, ironically, most of that was exaggerated by the intelligence community. The Steele dossier, which was used to get FISA warrants on Trump, was completely bogus. There was no PP tapes. There was no compromise on Donald Trump. That was made up by the guy who came up with the dossier. I guess it was Steele, the former British spy. And then Russian collusion. They accused Donald Trump of colluding with Russia, and we had the Mueller investigation. And what did that show? They could not establish that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia, but the way that Mueller phrased that, we couldn't establish, gave that little bit of an open door for liberals to go, well, he couldn't establish it, but there was tons of smoke there, so it must have happened. He just wasn't able to prove it. A guy with really an unlimited budget. I mean, he had all these lawyers, all the time in the world. If there was something there, they would have found it, but he was not able to. And so again, the intelligence community exaggerated this threat from Russia and this idea that Russia was involved in our, or was meddling in our democracy. And so the question really is, why was the intelligence community doing this, making this whole thing such a big deal? Well, the neoconservatives in D.C., the foreign policy establishment, they're long-term thinkers. I did a video recently about continuity within the State Department, where people who were serving back in the 90s and 2000s are still there. And the policy toward Russia is one where we were looking to, at some point, cause regime change in Russia. That's what we're aiming toward. And when Putin took the opposite side of us in Syria, that angered us. Of course, we have the coup in Ukraine in 2014. We were working toward trying to isolate Russia. And when Trump came up here and said, hey, I'll talk to this guy, there should be no problem or issue with having diplomacy. They said, oh crap, he's going to ruin it. We're not trying to talk to Russia. We're not trying to make things better. We're trying to make them worse. And Trump's going, hey, I'll sit down and talk with them, and I'll talk to Kim Jong-il. I'll talk to Xi. We'll get along. Why can't we get along? And that freaked out the foreign policy establishment. Donald Trump was ruining everything, and so they had to criminalize diplomacy, and that's why they were really going crazy with the Russian collusion stuff. Again, that was greatly exaggerated. But again, when it comes to our sovereignty, we're very protective. Meanwhile, we have our tentacles all over the world messing with other people. Let's continue to the next part. For this reason, the war in Kosovo in 1999 was a more dramatic and disturbing turning point for Russia and China than was the Iraq War of 2003. Both nations opposed NATO's intervention, and not only because China's embassy was bombed by an American warplane and Russia's distant Slavic cousins in Serbia were on the receiving end of the NATO air campaign. When Russia threatened to block military action at the UN Security Council, NATO simply sidestepped the United Nations and took it upon itself to authorize action, thus negating one of Russia's few tools of international influence. From Moscow's perspective, it was a clear violation of international law, not only because the war lacked a UN imprimatur, but because it was an intervention into a sovereign nation that had committed no external aggression. To the Chinese, it was just liberal hegemonism. Years later, Putin was still insisting that the Western nations leave behind this disdain for international law and not attempt to substitute NATO or the EU for the UN. The Russians and the Chinese were in good company. At the time, no less an authority than Henry Kissinger warned that the abrupt abandonment of the concept of national sovereignty risked a world unmoored from any notion of international legal order. The United States, of course, paid this little heed. It had intervened and overthrown sovereign governments dozens of times throughout its history. But even postmodern Europe set aside legal niceties in the interest of what it regarded as a higher Enlightenment morality. As Robert Cooper puts it, Europe was driven to act by the collective memory of the Holocaust and the streams of displaced people created by extreme nationalism in the Second World War. This common historical experience provided all the justifications necessary. Kissinger warned that in a world of competing truths, such a doctrine risked chaos. Cooper responded that postmodern Europe was no longer a zone of competing truths. But the conflict between international law and liberal morality is one that the democracies have not been able to finesse. As Chinese officials asked at the time of Tiananmen Square, and have continued to ask, what right does the U.S. government have to flagrantly interfere in China's internal affairs? What right indeed? Only the liberal creed grants the right, the belief that all men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights that must not be abridged by governments, that governments derive their power and legitimacy only from the consent of the governed and have a duty to protect their citizens' right to life, liberty, and property. To those who share this liberal faith, foreign policies and even wars that defend these principles, as in Kosovo, can be right even if established international law says they are wrong. But to the Chinese, the Russians, and others who do not share this worldview, the United States and its democratic allies succeed in imposing their views on others not because they are right, but only because they are powerful enough to do so. To non-liberals, the international liberal order is not progress, it is oppression. And I've done videos on this in the past. The international law-based order, which is put forward by Russia and China, versus the rules-based international order that we, the United States and Europe, support. And the problem with the rules-based international order, as we've admitted, is that the rules aren't clearly defined, and the rules that we do seem to understand, the United States will break these rules when they feel like it's necessary. So why should Russia and China follow a rules-based international order that we, the United States, don't really follow ourselves, despite the fact that we say that we do and that we support it? And so what the Chinese and Russians want is an international law-based order where the rules are clearly defined, agreed to by everybody, and we all follow them. And as Kagan points out here, we don't want that. We don't want that. We'll sidestep international law when necessary because we as democracies, we feel that what we think is right trumps international law. So we can just go around it if we want to. And Kissinger warned that if we do this, we're going to have chaos. And this article, again, was written in 2008. And since then, we've had now this war in Ukraine for the last year and a half. And Kissinger himself, at 100 years old, went to China because the diplomats that went before him, Tony Blinken, for example, were failing to really settle things down with China. So Kissinger himself was dusted off. He flew to China, and China greeted him as an old friend. And he went there to try to understand the Chinese better and be sort of an informal diplomat of the United States. So we were warned, if we ignore international law and we just do what we want, we are going to create chaos. And unfortunately, that is exactly what we've done. And then the last part, there is no perfect symmetry in international affairs. The twin realities of the present era, great power competition, and the contest between democracy and autocracy will not always produce the same alignments. Democratic India, in its geopolitical competition with autocratic China, supports the Burmese dictatorship in order to deny Beijing a strategic advantage. India's diplomats enjoy playing other great powers against each other, sometimes warming to Russia, sometimes to China. Democratic Greece and Cyprus pursue close relations with Russia, partly out of cultural solidarity with Eastern Orthodox cousins, but more out of economic interests. The United States has long allied itself with Arab dictatorships for strategic and economic reasons, as well as to successive military rulers in Pakistan. As in the Cold War, strategic and economic considerations, as well as cultural affinities, may often cut against ideology. So Kagan just said that we would, at times, ignore international law to defend the ideas of liberalism. So even if it was a violation, if it was for a greater good, we would just sidestep it. But then he's saying here that we're friends with Arab dictatorships, that we support the military in Pakistan. And just recently we have the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, say that he was overthrown by the yes, and he was democratically elected, and now he's been put in jail. So remember what I said in the beginning, are we an imperialist power who is imperialist against these other countries, these autocracies, because we believe in a higher principle, or are we just imperialist? In our actions, overthrowing democracies, aligning with dictatorships, aligning with military dictatorships, I would have to make the argument, and the evidence would seem to back it up, that we are simply imperialist and we're not moored or motivated by any ethical principles. We just say we are. That's a cover. We talk about, oh, we got to defend democracy. But if it's in our benefit, we will overthrow any democracy in this world if it furthers our own goals. So it's not democracy or liberalism that motivates us in our foreign policy. It's simply imperialism. And that is the conclusion that I've arrived at. And it's been a long road coming there. 15 years ago, I was against the Iraq War, but I thought, and naively enough, I thought that we had good intentions, we just made a mistake. And now I have to look back and go, it wasn't a mistake. There was no good intentions. It was simply imperialism, neoconservatives. trying to expand the power of the United States in the West, trying to maintain our empire. That's what we're doing. There's no higher purpose. There's no goodwill here where we're trying to do good and sometimes fall short. We are simply an imperialist power, scratching and clawing to maintain our place as China gets stronger and Russia gets stronger. That is what we're trying to do. And unfortunately, too many people in our country don't realize that. And as people have pointed out, most Americans, because of our geographical location, we have two oceans, on either side, Pacific Atlantic, we really don't pay attention too much to what goes on outside of our borders. So the war in Ukraine obviously is a huge issue, but your average American, they might have an opinion on it, but they're not really that into it because it doesn't affect us. Too much of what happens in the world does not affect the average citizen in the United States. So we can blow up the Middle East, destabilize Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine. We can do all that, but it doesn't really affect the lives of your average American citizen, and that is the problem. I don't know how you fix that. How do you get your average American more engaged? I don't know, and that seems to be our challenge moving forward, to educate people and to get them involved and to get them to understand what our foreign policy establishment is doing, because it is not making the world a safer and better place. It is destabilizing the world. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, the problem is nuclear weapons, China, Russia, United States. If we can't control this and we have enough loons in the right places, we could blow up this entire planet. And of course, when that happens, everybody loses. Well, that is it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.